And then the next type of business would be corporation. And corporation is definitely the most complex form of business. And if you wanted to define a corporation, the way most people would define it is that it is a separate legal entity. And that's a very curious way of looking at it. Separate legal entity. What does that mean? Basically means that the corporation almost has an identity. So just like a person, it has a tax ID number, it files a tax return, it has certain paperwork requirements. So it's almost like its own entity, its own identity. And that identity is separate from the people who actually own the corporation. So it's a very complex situation, and it's not the kind of thing that you see that often. In fact, there are fewer corporations than any other type of business. Now, if we decided to organize our business as a corporation, what would be the advantages? Well, one of the biggest advantages is limited liability. That's really the main reason that a lot of businesses decide to incorporate. Limited liability is a very advantageous situation because there's not going to be any one person who's going to be held totally liable. So that's a very big advantage. Another advantage is you can actually sell stock. In fact, that's the way you finance the business, is by selling stock. And all the people who own that stock have an ownership interest in the corporation. And also, a corporation can have a very lengthy lifespan. In fact, it can have an indefinite lifespan because the ownership of the corporation can continue on, and the ownership of the stock can be traded and sold to other people. So it could potentially last for many, many years. But like anything, if it has its advantages, it also has its disadvantages. And the first disadvantage is the fact that a corporation can be difficult and sometimes very expensive to organize. So it's going to require paperwork. You're going to be paying legal fees, accounting fees. You have to get special permission. So there's definitely going to be more obstacles in the way of organizing as a corporation as opposed to the other types of business organization. And then you have increased rules and regulations. And that ties in with something that we were talking about in an earlier video. Remember when we talked about the SEC? And remember, any company that sells stock to the public, they are regulated also by the SEC. So there's always an increase when you incorporate in terms of the scrutiny that you're under and the additional rules and regulations that you have to abide by. And then perhaps the biggest disadvantage of all would be the double taxation and the fact that everything in a corporation is taxed twice. Remember, we said before, it's a separate entity and it files its own tax return. So it's taxed as an entity, and then it's taxed again when all the stockholders turn around and pay their individual income tax. So that's a tremendous disadvantage. And then the final question that people often ask, which type of business organization is best? And in the end, there's really no clear answer. I mean, clearly they all have their own unique advantages and disadvantages. So really you would just have to look at the business itself. You would have to think about the type of business. Is it a service company? Is it a product? What is the location? What is the size? You'd have to consider all the pros and cons. And then once you make that decision, then you would begin to actually go through the process of organizing the business. Now, for accounting, it's very important for us to understand the different types of businesses, because each time we have a problem or an exercise that we go through and we record things, we're going to need to know the type of business that we're dealing with, because the way we account for things is going to be slightly different depending on the type of business. So if I'm trying to do the accounting, say, for a proprietorship, I would do that type of accounting very differently than I would for a corporation. So that's why we have to be at least familiar with all these different types of businesses, so that way as we move forward, we'll be prepared for that.